Okay, well, it got pretty quiet, so I think we are going to start on time. So welcome to JETC. Hopefully everybody was as energized with our morning panel as we were. Great to see all our uniformed members here. As we heard with Rear Admiral Vanderlei, risk mitigation is very important to all of us along the way, so what an appropriate topic. I'm excited today to be here as your moderator to host our speaker today, Diane. Over the past 20 years, Diane has supported more than $5 billion of complex and mission-critical construction in support of the U.S. agencies worldwide. In 2018, she founded CPM Schedule Solutions, grounded in the belief that effective construction schedules are crucial for any of our project successes. Her company specializes in CPM scheduling and training with a focus on our military construction. As an author, I was thrilled to learn that Diane has published a technical paper with the Association for the Advancement of Cost Engineering on military construction scheduling and has presented at their 2023 national conference. She regularly conducts webinars and training sessions, particularly on integrating construction schedules with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers construction management process. So as we get ready to go today, we do want this to be interactive. She's going to go ahead and do her presentation, but please start to pull together your questions. She's open for many questions to keep us live and make sure we're answering all your thoughts along the way. So again, here it is. It's an interactive session. She'll be doing some polling throughout. Please feel free to scan that QR code that you see up here, and it'll find the session, you'll find the presentation, and you'll be able to complete your survey, hopefully after she's done, right? But again, please help welcome Diane with me.
Thank you, Diane. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this session. All right, so when we've got the housekeeping items, I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with these, but silence phones, taking note of the exits, and these recordings will be available until the end of August. And thank you to our education session sponsors. All right. Okay.
So we were trying to do fun facts along the way. There's just a few fun facts about me. I grew up in Germany. I'm a proud Army. Okay, I'm going to be honest. I'm a proud spoiled Army brat. So let's not be shy. But really, we want to get focused on Diane. So we're going to go to her fun facts.
All right, so my fun facts is I was born and raised in New England, traveled around a lot with my husband when he was active duty Army as a military spouse, but ended up back in New England. I love exercise and audiobooks. That's how I do most of my reading. And we just got a new boxer puppy who's 10 weeks old. Okay, so we have the polls that disappeared. Okay. Yes. Okay, so we'll just skip that for now. So we'll just jump right into, did it go back? Could you see the polls? Yes. Okay, so the polls have 5 options. Yes. Okay, so if you can you see all 5 options right now? Okay, so so the polls, which schedule concern resonates the most with you? So this is just a question to get a better idea from your perspective, whether you're government or from the industry as a contractor, which one of these. So just to quickly speak through them, is it A, that the requirements are too difficult? Do you feel like as a contractor, these requirements are just hard to execute when it comes to scheduling? Or as a government, do you feel like there's just a lot and it's really heavy to review? B, do you feel like not everyone's on the same page? So you got different opinions on how the schedule should be used, maintained, updated. C, you have unreliable schedule docs, or it's just not very useful. You feel like maybe the schedule's submitted every month and it gets filed away, and then you're not really sure that it's being used to its potential. And then the last one, E or D, is, do you feel like rejected schedules are a big issue? Do you have rejected schedules, delayed progress payments, and does that hurt the overall project cash flow? Last off, critical path changes and surprises. So this, yes, is definitely a big one. You know, if you feel like the critical path changes every month, you don't really know why, or if you feel like things kind of pop up out of the blue on the critical path. Okay, so that's interesting, but understandable for the one that is the most. So these 5 schedule concerns correlate with the 5 risk strategies that we're going to be talking about today. And at the end of this session, there's a link I'll share with you where you can go to download some tools, and there are tools, especially with E there, that you can use just to put some of these mitigation strategies into place without having to start from scratch. So with that, we will jump right in. So our objective today is to talk about the 5 risk mitigation strategies that are specific to military construction. So unlike private sector projects, MILCON projects comparatively have tighter restrictions, right? A greater level of oversight, and this can be pretty challenging for both contractors who are responsible for executing those requirements, and then also the government who's responsible for doing the reviews. So we'll talk about these specific risks and how you can mitigate them to avoid these types of schedule issues. This includes first and foremost delays, but it also includes other construction management processes that the schedule touches, like progress payments, quality control, and submittals. So we're going to go over some actionable tips on how you can mitigate these risk issues that really anyone can implement regardless of any scheduling training or background. And like I said, because this is a lot of information I'm sharing today, at the end there'll be a link where you can go download some free resources, so you're just not starting from scratch if you chose to use them. Okay, so risk strategy 1 is to streamline schedule management. So when I say streamline schedule management, this starts with the project specifications and the requirements. So specifically, this is tailoring the contract and the specs to make sure that there's only value add requirements and processes. So this will allow the schedule management to not only be easier, but also provide greater returns for the efforts from all parties, whether you're the contractor executing or the government reviewing, and it all can be done to make sure that it aligns with the government's needs. So for a little bit more background, I mentioned earlier that the MILCON projects typically have more requirements and almost always more stringent levels of oversight than private sector, but just as an example, the standard specs for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is 24 pages. For NAVFAC, it's 30 pages. And these standard specs go over everything for the project, like activities, relationships, coding, and a bunch of other requirements that tell you what you can do and what you can't do. But what becomes a risk is when those tailored specs are not actually tailored for a project, given the individual scope, size, or complexity. So this is when, particularly when the specs aren't really paid that much attention to during bid, or they're just put out as a boilerplate. So really, because everybody has a hand in the project's success and schedule management, it benefits the whole team. It benefits everybody to take time up front to review. So for the government, this could be having one of your schedulers or someone within your district take a look at the scheduling spec during the design, during BCOE review, or just sometime before solicitation. For the contractor, this could be reviewing the schedule spec during pre-bid or during solicitation and just having the opportunity to ask questions where you need to. So if you plan on having a schedule consultant, you could also send it to them because they can probably give you some really good questions too. But engaging technical or schedule reviewers, if you have access to them, is a good thing to do too, because they can do in a few hours a lot of good work instead of much more damage control later on. So here's just an example of what I mean when I say tailoring and customizing the requirements. So in this example, the USACE standard specs refer to the initial schedule, which is one of the earlier schedules in the project, being submitted 42 days after notice to proceed. So this could be okay for smaller or mid-sized type projects, but if you have projects that go into the hundreds of millions or are very complex in nature, or that have multiple stakeholders or overlapping boundaries with lots of coordination, this might not be enough time. So if the government keeps this 42-day requirement on one of those larger or more complex projects, the risk really is having delayed submissions, having lower quality submissions, or having schedule rejections and resubmissions because it may not have been enough time to be fully developed to meet those requirements. And here's another example, the schedule's data date or cutoff point in the updating process. So if you think about the resources available within your office for schedule management, this is if you're government or contractor, oftentimes the data date will be at the end of the month. That's the cutoff point or the end point for the updating process. But if your office is overseeing, say, 20 projects at a time and they all have the same data date, say you only have one scheduler or a few schedulers or maybe a part-time scheduler, you're going to have a lot of strain on those resources in a short amount of time. So that, of course, can also compromise schedule quality. So if you stagger the data dates or these cutoff points with your updates, then you're going to reduce that overall risk of overburdening those resources. And as we'll talk about soon too, because the schedule touches so many other parts of the project, like payments, quality controls, and submittals, it affects more than just the folks overseeing the schedules, but the team as a whole. So here's one last example for this risk mitigation point. The standard scheduling specs also refer to there being 2 days of draft schedule review during the update cycle. So similar to the first example, this can be okay for smaller or mid-sized projects, but for larger or more complex projects that have multiple stakeholders or other complexities, you may want to have a full 3 or 4 days to review the draft. So this way, everyone can come prepared to the periodic schedule update meeting, draft schedule update meeting, prepared with questions to discuss so that by the time they get the final schedule submission that's formally transmitted, there's no surprises. And that decreases the risk of rejected schedules, which can then delay progress payments and cause downstream strains and other stresses on the project. So as a rule of thumb, when it comes to the contract specs and requirements, think back to your past projects. So while you still have the opportunity before a solicitation or award, think about from those past projects, where with the schedule, what do you need more of and what do you need less of? So what's been helpful and what hasn't been so helpful? Have there been any requirements that maybe you've spent a lot of time arguing about in past projects that really didn't do too much for the project anyway? And have there been any times when you've thought to yourself, if only we had this in the requirements or we didn't have this in the requirements, it would have made this job so much easier? So these are just things to think about while you still have the chance, during design or before solicitation, whether you're the government preparing or if you're the contractor reviewing before award and can ask those questions. Lastly, to think back to your projects and any pain points that you've repeatedly come up with the schedule. So see if there's any way that it could be addressed upfront in the contract or specifications to make sure that there's the clarity upfront instead of arguments later on. So for instance, how would you deal with schedule changes? What kind of flexibility does the contractor have to make these changes? And at what stage during the updating process do they need the government's approval? Or maybe it's fragnets with proposals. So does the government require a fragment with every proposal, or is it only with those proposals where there's going to be some kind of time impact and fragment is just a fragmented network, just a portion of the schedule? Or have you also had, repeated issues with time impacts and also how they get incorporated into the schedule? And then lastly, are there any questions about cost loading that can be addressed up front for clarity, like planning for payment for mobilization or store materials or things of that nature that could be put in the contract up front so it's clear? So while these issues can be addressed upfront and tailored in the specs as a risk mitigation strategy, they can also be discussed in our next strategy, which is risk strategy 2, which is to hold a pre-construction schedule meeting. So this is a meeting specific to the schedule at the beginning of the project. So this is a risk mitigation strategy because it allows all parties to align on the schedule's expectations and processes. And it also allows the team to talk through other construction management portions that are directly affected by the schedule, like progress payments, quality control, and submittals. So there's a lot to go over and get on the same page. So the schedule itself, it doesn't operate in a vacuum. It's connected with other CM functions. So we'll get into each of these individually, but the risk here lies when everyone isn't on the same page with the schedule first and foremost, because how much it touches and interfaces with these other functions. So getting into the first interface, it's with progress payments. So it's common in MILCON projects that the contractor needs to submit an acceptable schedule prior to the government processing payment. This is especially true when the schedule is cost-loaded because then it serves as the basis for the progress payments. So because of this direct relationship between the schedule and progress payments, it's important that all parties get on the same page. So unaccepted schedules, late schedules, or rejected schedules can lead to delayed payments, and really that hurts everybody. So items to talk about in a pre-construction schedule meeting can be, the flow and sequence from schedule updates to the progress payment submission. So what are the specific deliverables as part of the update? How are the statuses being agreed upon? Is it in the field? Is it in a specific meeting? And just what does that process look like? And some other examples to get on the same page with this is how many days will there be for that draft review that we just talked about really before? To just go over this workflow that's detailed out in the specs if it is, so that everyone can get on that same page to understand that workflow. And then also going over the expectations for the periodic schedule update meeting. So who's going to be there, who's going to be leading it, who's going to be taking notes, and so on. So sometimes these meetings are set like the second Tuesday of every month, or they're targeted for the 10th of every month, but just understanding what that rhythm and what that flow is going to look like, because there are multiple steps, and it feels like sometimes as soon as you finish the process, then you have to start the next process for the next month. And then lastly, like we talked upon earlier, what will be the schedule's data date or the cutoff point? So what is it that works best for both teams? So now we're going to go on to quality control as another topic to go over in the schedule pre-construction meeting setting. And I know you might be thinking this is an entirely different function, but there is a very close relationship here. So MILCON projects like those for the Army Corps of Engineers, they require the schedule to have a coding structure that's based on the definable features of work directly from the contractor's quality control plan. So the feature of work in the quality control plan and the feature of work in the schedule, they need to line up. They need to be apples to apples and saying the same thing. So if the schedule is missing activities within a feature of work, then that would be a red flag, because it's showing that that work is not accounted for in the schedule. And then also just making sure that the sync-up happens so that teams can plan backwards with a good level of accuracy for their preparatory meeting, the first phase of the 3-phase quality control process. And then it allows them to plan back even farther for submittals to make sure that those are in and accepted prior to the start of the prep meetings. And when I say this interface between quality control and schedule allows backwards planning for submittals, this is an example of what that looks like. So after the contractor creates their feature of work listing from the QC plan, and then it's reflected in the activity codes in their schedule. If they are working for a USACE project that uses Resident Management System, RMS, then they can tie the submittal register to the schedule, and then that will populate need by dates that you can see right here. So it'll populate a submit needed by, approval needed by, and material needed by. So these dates can also be manually just hand jammed into the submittal register, but if you make those ties between the schedule and the submittal register, it can just auto-populate and auto-update by itself. So these need by dates basically just run on autopilot after that link is established. And that reduces the risk of overlooked or late submittals that would be needed prior to starting a feature of work. So I'm going to share an overall graphic of how this linking works, and that's going to bring all of this together. So you first start by making sure that you have all the features of work accounted for in the construction schedule. And then when you link the schedule to the submittal register, it'll populate when the materials need to be received by, when the submittal needs to be approved by, and then when the submittals need to be provided by. So after this linking is done with the schedule driving all of this information, the submittal register will auto-populate and auto-update all of those need-by dates. So then every time the contractor uploads a new schedule, all of those dates will be updated right away. So if this linking is not performed, then those dates would just have to be manually updated and maintained. So along these same lines, another submittal type related topic to talk about in a pre-construction schedule meeting is going to be long lead procurement. So this is typically procurements that are over 90 days in duration. So by having this as an agenda item in this type of meeting, you can get on the same page with what this looks like in the schedule, how will costs be handled for either stored materials off-site or materials delivered on-site, and also syncing up on to what extent submittal activities are shown in the schedule, because you do also want to make sure that the schedule doesn't become the submittal register. You've already got the submittal register doing that job, so just being careful not to duplicate those efforts. So that wraps it up for risk strategy 2, and that's to hold that pre-construction schedule meeting so that all parties can get on the same page with expectations and processes, and that includes those with those other construction management type functions that we went over. Okay, so now we're going to get into risk strategy 3, which is to jointly agree on the schedule statuses to minimize schedule rejections, resubmissions, and delays that could impact schedule management. Just going to take a sip.
For those that are standing, we love the standing room only, but if you'd like to have a seat, there are plenty of seats up front as well, so feel free to join.
All right, so this risk strategy involves jointly confirming, as the contractor and as the government, schedule activity statuses prior to the schedule being updated. So as we'll talk about, this is critical for schedule accuracy, projections, and also resolving delays. So when this risk strategy is implemented, you'll be reducing the need for overall schedule revisions, resubmissions, and overall delays, being able to use the schedule as a management tool. And that can have severe impacts on site when the schedule no longer becomes usable because it's no longer current. So agreeing on statuses before the schedule is updated, make sure that you have reliable schedule documentation to also look back on in the event you have to analyze any kind of scheduled delays or time impacts. So when I say agree on activity statuses prior to the schedule being updated, here's an example of what that looks like. So this is basically just the raw data that's fed into the schedule, and that ultimately determines its output. So one mistake I do notice often is construction teams that focus only on physical percent complete, and that's especially true when the schedule is cost loaded and serves as the basis for progress payments. But it is also really important to look at things like the actual start, the actual finish, and remaining duration. So fortunately, it's only really those 4 data points, those 4 columns, but remaining duration is one of the most commonly overlooked items to review, but I'll also explain that importance here too. So more than just physical percent complete. So why is this important from a risk perspective? So schedule statuses determine not only payment, but they drive the schedule output. So this is schedule planned start and finish dates, your critical path, near critical paths, and completion date, and really also what your liability looks like for time impacts and delays. So if the schedule is updated and then status is changed after the fact. So if you swap the order of agreeing first and then doing the update, it can affect the schedule's output entirely. So agreeing on schedule statuses prior to monthly updates, it also ensures that those statuses and the schedule as a whole is accurate, and that plays a large part in resolving time impacts. So if statuses aren't jointly agreed upon at the time, then they could change later on, and no one can really have a strong leg to stand on. So for example, in one of my delay analysis I did in the past year or so, when I was reviewing the schedules over about 2 years of time, there would be some activities with start and finish dates that would change constantly. So just as an example here, if this activity roughens in area A, in one update it said it started in September, and then the next update, the actual start was removed, and then in the next update it said, well, we actually started this activity June of 2023, and then the next update, we actually started July 31st of 2023. So you can see how this kind of pattern, if these dates are put in without a whole lot of oversight, QC, or agreement, then it can become very difficult when it comes to having an accurate schedule, but also being able to perform delay analysis, because it can cause so many more gray areas, and it also makes the schedule appear unreliable. So here are the 4 highlighted columns of information to review and agree upon. This fortunately doesn't have to be massive amounts of data for you to be reviewing. It's only these 4 columns, but starting with these first 2, actual starts and actual finishes. So these are pretty straightforward. This is just reviewing and agreeing upon when an activity actually started or when it actually finished. So it's either the contractor or the government reviewing and agreeing upon these. You can use your project documentation to confirm these dates, like your QA or QC reports, site photos, meeting minutes, dates from the submittal register, correspondence, serial letters, or inspection logs, and really just any other resources you have on hand. So the next status we're going to talk about is the physical percent complete. This is the one that most people are familiar with, and it's typically set up to correlate with payment for that activity. So if an activity is, say, 50% complete, then the payment for that activity is also going to be 50% complete. But be aware, though, that there is a difference between duration percent complete and physical percent complete. So make sure the status that you're reviewing, if you're given the sheet or if you're preparing the sheet, has physical percent complete and not duration percent complete. That's how the standard MilCon specs speak to physical to percent complete being updated. And it's also a manual input into the schedule instead of a auto calculation from the scheduling software. It can't just be auto-populated. The contractor needs to go in and manually add this activity is this amount physically percent complete all the way through. And last, we'll touch upon the remaining durations, and that's often overlooked because there's really just not a whole lot of awareness on how much this data point affects the schedule's output. So the remaining duration is the estimated amount of days to complete an activity. So if you have a 10-day activity that's 50% complete, the remaining duration would probably be 5 days. This isn't always the case, though, because it's not always linear. Sometimes the bulk of the work can be done earlier on in the duration or later in the duration, but most of the time it is linear. So this one is important because an activity's remaining duration determines its planned finish date. So it's not the physical percent complete that determines that, it's the remaining duration. So if these remaining durations aren't reviewed or statused properly, then you're going to be seeing some bad schedule output, like incorrect start and finish dates, critical path or near critical paths, or the project's completion date, or risks that are skewed inappropriately. So the best case scenario I can recommend to mitigate overall risks on statuses that we've been talking about is to print off the status sheet as either a PDF or Excel or some other type of document, and then have both parties review, make any markups, any disagreements or any changes, and then when it's good to go, sign it. That way it's memorialized as a document and can always be referenced back. So some of the most successful projects I've worked on have followed this process or a variation very similar to it, because the statuses were reviewed and agreed to at the time of each update. We'd had the documentation to show it, and then we'd also have reliable planned start and finish dates, and then also critical and near critical paths. So because of this, we've also been able to resolve time impacts significantly quicker than on other projects when the scheduled updates didn't have as much reliable information. So that's definitely an upside. So in summary, risk strategy 3 is to jointly review the schedule statuses prior to the schedule update to make sure that you have solid raw data that's going into the schedule. This will make sure that you have accurate projections and reliable schedules to resolve any potential time impacts as easily as possible. My recommendation with this one is to document this joint review as a signed status sheet by both parties. All right, so now we're going to jump into risk strategy 4, and that's to leverage your draft schedule reviews. So by taking advantage of draft schedule reviews, which are required in some of the standard specifications, it just depends on the agency, you can compile questions and comments for a focused and productive periodic schedule update meeting. So taking advantage of the draft reviews increases the likelihood of an accepted final or formal schedule submission, and this reduces the risk for rejections, resubmittals, delayed progress payments, and other closely related construction management processes that interface and link with the schedule. So here's an example of the standard USACE spec that refers to the periodic schedule update meeting. So with this process, the contractor first submits their draft schedule update to the government, and then the government has 2 days to review, and then the contractor holds that periodic schedule update meeting. And then after that, the contractor formally submits their final schedule, and that goes in as a transmittal. So if the government takes advantage of that draft review period, they can come to that schedule update meeting prepared and with questions and with discussion points. So this meeting is a great time for everyone to talk about the schedule because it's still in that draft form, and the contractor can incorporate any changes from that discussion into their final submission. So during this meeting, items to talk about often cover, schedule statuses, changes, and any issues. And if the government takes advantage of this draft review period, then they can bring those questions to this meeting to talk about them before the contractor formally submits their schedule. And what happens when the teams take advantage of this draft schedule review period is that by the time the contractor formally submits, there's no surprises. So when the government receives the schedule that's formally submitted as a transmittal, they've already reviewed the draft, they've already talked about it in the meeting, they've talked about any questions or comments, and they have an idea of what to expect. So really there should be no surprises, and this helps facilitate the schedule being reviewed, being accepted, and moving forward with payment much faster than if the government is seeing the schedule for the first time as a formal submittal. So following this draft review process has been a real game changer for a lot of my projects. Not only does it decrease the risk of schedule rejections, but it also helps to decrease overall project stress. Because you've had that meeting, you have those mutual understandings, and you've had the discussions about changes, issues, risks, and then steps moving forward to mitigate those risks. So here are some of the most important items that I recommend the government have eyes on during this draft review time to come prepared to the schedule meeting. So there's a lot to review with schedules, but if you focus on these ones, it'll give you the best return for your time. So first off, just having an idea of the overall status. So where was the completion date or interim milestones before, and where is it now? If there were any changes in the completion date, is it clear to you why that was? Did the critical path change from the previous update? If it did, why did that happen, and what's the new critical path? What are some of the near critical paths? Is there anything sneaking up behind everyone that maybe no one's watching? What changes are being made? So are you clear on what the plan was before, what was the plan now, and then why did it change? So just making sure that you write down any of your questions before you go to the meeting so you can talk about it with the contractor at a meeting. And oftentimes, when they send over a draft submission or the reports, you've got pages and pages and pages of reports to go through, but sometimes just having that simple discussion, what was the plan before now, or what was the plan before, what's the plan now, and then why did it change? It really just helps add a lot of context. And then lastly, what do you see as, your top 3 most important items, top 5 or top 10? So these are the most important items to look at when you're reviewing the draft schedule, to just really, as much as possible, leverage that process. So if you talk about these during the during the periodic schedule update meeting, then there'll be no surprises by the time the schedule is formally submitted, and that reduces the risk of rejected schedules, delayed schedules, and that can hurt the flow of progress payments and overall schedule management. Okay, so now we're going to go on to risk strategy 5, which is looking beyond the critical path. And this one correlates with the highest polling item that we got, the biggest concern about critical paths changing or not, being questionable. So in the previous slide, I just mentioned making a list of top 3, top 5, or top 10 risk items that you see. So I'm going to show you right now how to do that in a very quick and easy process from the schedule. So by looking beyond the critical path, you're also looking at near critical paths. So say, for instance, your critical path has 0 days float, and then the near critical path behind it has 1 day of float, and then after that it has 3 days of float. So if that path with 1 or 3 days of float, if you don't have visibility on it and if you're not tracking it, then it could very well become 0 days float or negative float, and then start impacting the project or impacting the completion date. So by looking at near critical paths beyond the primary critical path, you can leverage the schedule's ability to help prioritize your project's risks, and that way you know where to focus your efforts for the greatest returns. So with the example I gave in the previous slide, if you're not looking at near critical paths, then they can come up from out of nowhere sometimes and catch everyone off guard. So I don't know if you've ever had a project with a critical path that seemed to change every month and maybe you weren't sure why. So that would be because the top float paths may have been competing, they may have been very close, and it didn't take much for one of the near critical paths to overcome the primary critical path and start to delay it if it wasn't being looked at or if the team just didn't have any visibility on it. So looking beyond the critical path gives you an understanding of, first off, what's critical, but also what's next most critical, and after that, and so on. You can see in the schedule what the priorities are and in what order, so that you know where to focus your efforts. If you're not performing this exercise, then sometimes everything can become critical, and then nothing is critical. So this really helps teams know where to prioritize and then execute. When you've got visibility on those near critical paths, you can see not only critical, but what's right behind it. So you can see the second most critical, third most critical, and so on. And it really helps to make sense out of what can be massive amounts of information in a schedule, translated into something that's actually useful, simple, and a powerful risk mitigation tool. And this is an exercise I do with each and every schedule review that I do, and our team does as well. So if your team has a simple and prioritized list from near critical activities, you're going to know where to focus your team's absolute best, their efforts for the best return. So I'm going to show you an example of how this works now. So fortunately, you do not need to be a seasoned scheduler or really know much about scheduling to do this. All you need to do is all you need to have is a float paths printout from the schedule file, and I'm going to give you those tools at the end of this presentation. But people are most familiar with the critical path, right? So this is normally the red activities in the Gantt chart. It's the one that everyone talks about mostly because it tells you when the project is going to finish and what work is driving the project's completion. Here's an example of a critical path that we'll say is our schedule. You know, it's an early project schedule. What we can see from this snapshot is that the critical work is first notice to proceed, and then it's submission of the environmental protection plan. So we know that that is our top priority. But then we look at near critical paths next. So by using this view in the layout, using this view in the schedule, which is very quick and easy to do, we can see that the demolition plan has 2 days of float. So that's right behind the critical path that has 0 days of float. And then next we see that the steel shop drawings have 4 days of float. So we know that if these shop drawings are delayed by 4 days, they'll have 0 days float, and they may very well become critical. Next, we've got the transformer shop drawings that have 9 days of float, and that's because there's a long fabrication time. So we know that's next most critical following the steel. And then after that, we have submission of the construction site plan, which makes sense because it is a pre-construction submittal. So if we put all of this together to track, say, our top 5 priorities in terms of immediate risk, the top priority is the environmental protection plan because it has 0 days float and it's on the critical path. The next priority is the demolition plan, followed by the steel shop drawings, transformer shop drawings, and the construction site plan. So again, this is just a project that's, example project that's getting started. So if you're the contractor deciding, I've got this huge stack of submittals I know I need to get through, this tells you the order to go through them. And if you're the government and if you have a stack of submittals on your desk, you'll know, my top 5 priorities are these submittals. And that way you can prioritize what to go after first to decrease risk the most. So here's an important concept to keep in mind, that both parties can take float from the project, but both parties can also give float back to the project. So if everyone's tracking the most critical items in a prioritized list that's driven by objective schedule data, knowing where to focus your efforts, you may actually end up giving float back to the project. So for instance, if the contractor knows that the environmental protection plan is critical, if they prioritize that and get it done in 10 days instead of their planned 20 days, then they're giving 10 days of float back to the project. And if the government's aware that the environmental protection plan is critical path, I'm going to focus this review. I'm going to return this review in 20 days instead of 30 days. Then they're giving 10 days of float back to the project. So that gives everybody more wiggle room. It gives everyone more cushion, and that decreases overall project risk, and it is one of the most powerful tools to use in everyday schedule and project management. Okay, so I'm going to show you a website to go, but with each of these risk strategies, there's a tool that you can grab. So with this first one, risk strategy 1, that has to do with the value add schedule requirements. This is a PDF checklist that walks you through some recommended customization strategies for these value add type requirements we talked about. Reducing the burden on contractors to execute and the government to review, while also making sure that it's aligning with the government's needs. And then risk strategy 2, for the schedule pre-construction meeting, this is a Excel file that's a schedule and pay request calendar. It's something that is very visual, and of course you can edit, use, share any of these tools, but it just kind of lays out what's the process, what's the workflow going to look like, and you can get on the same page in this meeting talking about agreeing on statuses, how long do we have to review the draft, when's the final, is there certain cutoffs every time of the month, but this just helps visually lay out that process, and you can, of course, edit and update to best suit your team's needs. And then number 3, the third tool with jointly agreeing on statuses. This is a PDF lesson plan from one of our trainings on how to jointly review statuses. And it focuses a lot on that status perspective. It goes a lot deeper, provides a lot more information and tips and recommendations. So that one's in there as well. That's a PDF. And then Risk Strategy 4 with the draft schedule reviews. This is a Word document that you can write down any notes during the draft schedule review, and you can also use it as an agenda tool during the schedule update meeting. Fully editable, it's not locked or anything, so feel free to use, customize if you find it helpful. And then the last one, looking beyond the critical path, though. So there's 2 Primavera P6 layout files that come in here too. You can import them into P6, or you can send them to your scheduler if you have someone that uses P6. But this gives you these views right here that we saw that lays out the float paths. And if you don't have P6 or anything like that, you could always ask whoever runs your schedules to provide a float paths layout. It's a very quick and easy thing to do. It shouldn't be an issue, but that way you can develop your list of top 3 priorities, top 5, or top 10. You can go through and do that exercise that we just did in that last strategy. So here's the link that you can go to download. If you have any issues, then just shoot me an email here and I'll send them to you as well. And that's all I had.
So I'm going to stay seated since you're going to take calls. Okay. So as a small business owner of a construction firm, there were a lot of tools, and I certainly appreciate the tools. So thank you for sharing that to take back to my operations team. So we want to open it to questions, but I'm going to start. We had a few that came in. So as we all know, we're extremely busy in our everyday workflow, and I can imagine when you take this back to your teams. So one of the questions that came in was, how would you prioritize scheduling risk mitigation in day-to-day operations?
So that one I'd say is definitely Risk Strategy 5, which I think a lot of you feel as well. It's using those near critical paths so that you can prioritize and execute, because I think a challenge with a lot of our projects is there's tons of documents, there's tons of schedule documents especially. We get them, sometimes they're thousands of pages long. So just being able to take out the stuff that's really important, extract it just through that very simple exercise, and share that with the team. Here's our top 3, our top 5, our top 10. This is what we need to focus on the most in the next 4 weeks or 6 weeks. But it just helps to take what's massive amounts of information and to translate it into something usable and easy, and just really helps extract what the schedule, which is I built my business because I believe the schedule is a very powerful tool, and it just really helps to leverage it as that powerful tool, because with the example you saw, you can give float back, and then when you need to start taking the float, if you've got an unforeseen site condition or if you have procurement issues, then the float is there, but you can't know to give it back if you don't have visibility of it on the first place.
So we're going to go ahead and open it up to questions. There are mics in the center. Please don't be shy. I'm sure there are many questions going on. Thank you.
Hey, Diane, that was great. Lots of good information. I took a lot of notes. Karen Dermaguilera, I'm the Executive Director for Arlington National Cemetery and Army Cemeteries. So I'm the owner and the end user, of these projects, whether it's USACE or we even have Federal Highways doing a Milcom project for us. Greatly different approaches to the way highways approach the schedules in the Corps. It's pretty interesting. But one of the things that you said, there was a lot you said that resonated, but one of the things you said that's been a real problem for us, and it was about cost loading for mobilization and stored materials. If that is not in the contract, then the contractor and the government are going to get into a big argument about how to pay, if to pay for stored materials, where they should be stored, as well as the mobilization. So can't emphasize enough about what a problem that can cause.
Yes.
And then the other thing I was thinking of as you went through this, really helpful, but for large projects, I rarely see either the government or the contractor meet those contract requirements on schedules because the durations are so short for large projects. Anyway, very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yes, and I agree that having the requirements on mobilization, storm materials, if it's not in the contract, if it's not clearly spelled out, it's a great thing to talk about early on for cost loading planning purposes. Yes. Hello.
Diane, thank you very much. Lieutenant Commander John Nerthen, I'm coming from Kings Bay, Georgia. A couple comments and then a question.
Mm-hmm.
The checklist that you referred to, super helpful. Kind of a public service announcement just to make sure that we know that it's out there. But in the whole building design guide, in the scheduling spec, the 01, 32, 17, 20, whatever the number is, there is actually a link to a very, very prescriptive checklist that is very helpful in building these requirements and a lot of these risk mitigation strategies that you speak to. Mm-hmm. Almost so much so that I wouldn't necessarily even call it a strategy, I would call it a requirement. It's already in the contract. It's in the spec, and there's a checklist. And the first one on that, number 0, is the preliminary scheduling meeting. And the value of that obviously is dependent on the people involved and the amount of time. But in our office, where we found a lot of value is we've put a lot of prioritization on that preliminary scheduling meeting, exactly what you call the pre-construction schedule meeting. And we go through the spec together and ensure there's a mutual understanding. It's usually 2 to 3 hours long. It's painful, it's dry, but it is super beneficial to have a mutual understanding of what the spec's calling for and how we on the government interpret it and how the contractor interprets it. And a lot of those risk mitigation strategies that you call out are gone over in that meeting, and we identify those things. That being said, one of the things that I don't have clarity on, and I'd love to get your perspective on, is long lead items, procurement timelines. So you said in one of your slides, typically 90 plus days. Can you give a little bit of background as to that number 90? Mm-hmm. And if you, again, it's not perfect, there's not a perfect definition that I know exists as to what's long lead and what's considered long lead, because it's a little bit dependent. But the idea that, how do you identify long lead items? Do you just identify long lead items as far as things that could affect your critical path or are on your critical path? Yep. Do you identify them at contract award so there is a clarity as to what we're calling long lead, so that when we get a delay of something that wasn't previously considered long lead but then becomes long lead and ultimately affects your critical path, we're not kind of scrambling to figure out who's at fault, who's responsible, and what our actions are going to be. But from what we've done in the field, we don't have clarity on what's considered long lead and how we identify that up front to help implement mitigations and avoid risk later down the road.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. So I'd say if I went off 90 days because that's what the standard core spec speaks to, and I think if you had the opportunity to customize your specs during design, if you wanted to define long lead as over 30 days or over 120 days, you have the opportunity to further clarify that and define that in the specs. But typically 90 days in the schedule, because I think it's also important to make sure, like I said before, that the schedule doesn't become the submittal register. So you don't want to be seeing, contractor prepare submittal, government review submittal, procure 5 days of drywall, deliver drywall to site. It becomes very cluttered in the schedule when you have all of those types of activities. So I think as a good rule of thumb, it's 90 days, or if you wanted it to be a little bit longer or shorter, you could define that in the specs too. But another tool for doing that, for tracking it, like you mentioned, is to have a spreadsheet early on in the process. And that's where you can use the contractor's definable feature of work as a benchmark. Like if you know that you've got a DFOW for transformers, you're probably going to have long lead in there, or switchgear, or structural steel. That'll give you a really good idea where to start. And if it's a discussion that starts to take place shortly after NTP, or maybe even a agenda item in the scheduled pre-con meeting, we want to be tracking these, we want to list. That way we have an expectation for the schedule, because you're right, last thing you want to have happen is this long lead item that wasn't there and then pops up and is all of a sudden multiple months behind or lots of negative float because it wasn't tracked. So I think using the DFOW to create a list early on would be a great way to get started. Yes, you're welcome.
Good morning, Lieutenant Junior Grade Marquis Stewart with Coast Guard FDCC Seattle. Just want to get your best perspective on, as far as project controls, what's the best method of delay analysis that you've seen work in your opinion, whether that's a simple as planned, as built, based on a critical path, or a windows analysis, or a time impact analysis?
Gotcha, thank you. Yeah, so I think in terms of delay analysis, the more that you can look forward, the better. If you have the opportunity to look forward at a delay instead of looking backward, it is 10 times easier to do a forward-looking delay analysis, prospective, instead of backwards-looking forensic. It's just the various methods involved. It's much easier to look forward. So in the industry as well, AACE is the professional organization most involved with project controls, and they write a lot of recommended practices based on delay analysis to provide some type of guidance. And they do recognize that if you're looking at a delay in the future, even though it may not be exact, it may not be precise, if you're taking a best guess, it is still, 9 times out of 10, the preferred method instead of looking backwards, because you're going to be spending much more time, much more resources to look backwards instead of looking forwards. So I would say sometimes you'll come across a team, and I know I have before, where they say, we've got this delay, but we just want the delay to finish, and then we'll analyze it. The harm in that is that you're then looking backwards, and it becomes much more complex, much more gray. Whereas if you were looking forwards, then you have a new, say for instance, you do a delay analysis looking forwards, and you have a set completion date, then it's established, and then everyone knows they need to work towards this date. But if there's a delay that's ongoing and no one knows, government owns this delay, contractor owns the delay, or if both parties think each other own the delay, then they lose everyone kind of loses the incentive to, keep going, because both parties are thinking the other party owns it, So I think as much as possible, looking forward, resolving time impacts quickly, while they may not be exact or precise, it far outweighs looking at delays backwards for those reasons.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Quang Nguyen with NAVFAC Atlantic, and I appreciate the information and the strategy you provide there. So we have projects that actually Corps engineers involved in overseas, and it's not unusual that we have to deal with the host nation when it comes to certain approval. An issue might become a small issue might take long, and sometimes you don't know how long it takes, because you got to touch on, sometimes you need to reach out to the U.S. embassies and their liaisons to really work the issues. So we do have known unknowns up front of the project. So I just want to get your thoughts and perspective on how you deal with a situation like that. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when you have known unknowns, one of the more common methods I've seen is to, just to disclose it in the specs and say, here's this target that we're tracking, but this target may flux. So that way, at least the contractor can put it as maybe an interim milestone in the schedule, and then everyone can be tracking it on a monthly basis for every update. And that way, just knowing that it's there, knowing that it does have a lot of potential variability, but at least everyone has eyes on it and knows how to plan for it. So, and I've worked with some projects like that too, where there's a big unknown, or you're working with other contractors with overlapping, limits of disturbance, or there's multiple contractors and there's just so many variables up there. So it's, putting as much coordination in the specs as you can, and then, disclosing these are the unknowns, and then here's a target to benchmark, because it's also balancing risk too, right? Because the government wants to be able to give some kind of target, so everyone kind of knows who's responsible if it goes too far, because the contractor needs to be able to make assumptions for pricing too, right? So that would be my recommendation, to have a best guess as early on as possible, and just be tracking it every month. And you could also have backup plans. If it goes X amount of months in the future, then here's something we kind of have in our back pocket to resequence or rearrange just as a backup plan.
One more question. Yes, sir.
I'm Craig Hildebrandt with the company David Bull Incorporated. We're a small business contractor. I have a question on out-of-sequence progress. So I've met certain agencies that are very disciplined with out-of-sequence progress. They want all revisions made whenever there's any out-of-sequence. They want the conventional finish-to-start relationships changed to finish with lags and then become maintenance nightmares through the life of the job. Now I've had other agencies that are accepting of them on a case-by-case basis, provided they're expected to resolve themselves within 30 or 60 days. And I think no matter how minute you break activities into, most scheduling processes are out of sequence by nature. Any general area before you finish hanging drywall, somewhere you'll be taping and finishing, or similar to that, painting. All the processes, there's always some amount of overlap that unless every activity, or 75% of them, you start to start, finish to finish. So I guess I'm looking for what are your recommendations with respect to handling and what is an acceptable amount of out-of-sequence progress that should be accepted in the schedule update?
Right, so I agree. Out of sequence, it can definitely get some folks fired up, and it does vary on the agency and on the specs, and also on the team, on the construction team itself. So I think a lot of times an out of sequence condition can indicate that there's not enough detail in the schedule. So for instance, if you start an activity and then if it stops and then stays, if it's a 10-day activity, for instance, you get 5 days in and then it stops and it becomes out of sequence and then it doesn't finish for another 6 months or so. It's like you've got chunk A of work and then chunk B of work. It should have just been 2 activities. You know, you're doing this portion of the work now and then that portion of the work later. Then you're not going to have an out of sequence activity. So most of the time, out of sequence conditions indicate that there just needs to be more detail. But I think sometimes, you know, if it truly is an out of sequence condition, then it's just updating the logic, making it current, because you do also want to make sure that you have accurate finish dates. If you don't make those updates, then the finish dates are not going to be particularly reliable. So it just depends on, you know, is this finishing in the next month or is it finishing 6 months from now? If it's 6 months, I'd say close it and then make another activity specific to that remaining work. But I think without a sequence too, a lot of it's just, if you're the contractor communicating to the government, you know, this was the plan before, this is the plan now, and here's why it changed. You know, here's why our sequence needed to change. We have a mod, or we have unforeseen site condition, or we've got trades that need to resequence for whatever reason. So I think just keeping that in mind when it comes to communicating with the government, if they understand why, then, you know, they may be more receptive to allowing the out of sequence condition to remain if they just have that understanding. So.
Well, Diane, thank you. I think you brought through
Should we have one more?
many answers and questions. We are at 11:30,
Okay.
so we are going to cut it short. I'm sure Diane's going to be here throughout the conference, so please look for her. She has left her business cards as well, and if you could just join me in a round of applause for her. Thank you.